And we are live. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents, and welcome back to your weekly update on all things COVID-19, government authoritarianism, and all the just darn craziness that's been going on in the world. I'm joined tonight by Night Shift 10,000, Filthy Heretic, and we've got plenty to discuss, as we usually do. But as always, let's start this stream off by looking at where the U.S. national debt and the Federal Reserve's balance sheet are at. As of right now, the U.S. national debt is sitting at $26,617,518,000,000. And then, of course, as always, once you get down to the 100,000s, it's rising so fast it's not even worth trying to say. So we are over the halfway point towards 27 trillion. Again, the national debt is growing slower than it was for about a month now. The growth has slowed, although certainly not stopped. And the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is still sitting at about 7 trillion. Now, there are those that say that all the fact that the Fed's balance sheet has slowed in growth, or more or less stayed steady at about 7 trillion for the past month or so, is proof that all the doomsday naysayers, the people like us, are just a bunch of crazy conspiracy theorists. And now the Fed will start dialing back its balance sheet. However, it's interesting because the Fed has already posted a note on its own website that says, and I owe it to Peter Schiff for tweeting out an article that showed this, but basically on the Fed's own website, there is now a chart that explains the Fed's balance sheet, what it is. It says the Fed's balance sheet grows and contracts over time, and yet on their very own chart, you can see that the Fed's balance sheet never contracts. It only grows, and over the past, since this February, it's radically shot upwards. So, and even key economists at the Fed, as reported by MarketWatch, are saying that the economy will need an additional 5 to 12 trillion in help. And I think, and we will talk about that a little bit later on. But to start off this evening, I want to talk about our commander-in-chief, President Donald Trump. As we all know, the conservatives and the MAGA hat wearers have told us that Donald Trump was the greatest thing that ever happened to America. He is the one who will stop America's descent into socialism, turn us around, and, well, let's face it, make America great again. And has Donald Trump made some decisions that I think at least send the right message to Americans? Yes, I think he has. Everyone has their pros and cons, but as far as has Donald Trump been a president that severely turned America away from socialism? Absolutely not. And that is evidenced by the fact that over the past week, Donald Trump has signed at least 4 executive orders, the first of which is that he's finally made good on his promise to ban the social media app TikTok. Now, we discussed last week, and I think the week before, TikTok is, as I'm sure everyone knows, a very popular social media app, particularly among teenagers, where you post stupid 15-minute videos and that everyone goes crazy over. However, the controversy comes from the fact that TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, and under Chinese law, the Communist Party of China can at any time demand that any Chinese company hand over data about the company, about its employees, about its users. So the concern is that Donald Trump has said he doesn't want Americans using TikTok lest the Chinese government gain control of your personal data. Now, whether or not you want the Communist Party to have your personal data, I think is, I don't think anyone should particularly want the Communist Party to have their data, but I would believe that is a decision you, as a private individual, should make for yourself. However, freedom-loving Donald Trump, who believes in the vision of the Founding Fathers of a free society and a nation that will not be centrally governed with authoritarianism, seems to think it is a good idea to tell all Americans everywhere they may not use TikTok. Now, it's the question as to whether or not this is even constitutional has already been brought up, and I don't think it is. But I'm certain this will go to the courts. I'm just amazed that the folks on the conservative side are not more up in arms about this.
Well, I mean, that's one thing that a lot of people don't really seem to grasp. People are alarmed and surprised when during Barack Obama's years, when the Republican Party was the foremost critic, the conservatives, the Tea Party. And I noticed because I was part of that organization, the Tea Party, where we were all up in arms about how Obama was expanding the debt, expanding the deficit, endless government spending, endless legislation from the pulpit where he would just sign executive order after executive order after executive order that did this, that did that, that did everything under the sun. But now that the person in power who has an R next to their name, enclosed in parentheses next to a D, suddenly they do exactly the same thing, continuing foreign wars of aggression in the Middle East, running up deficits, running up massive deficits, doing absolutely everything. In fact, the fact of the matter is that under Donald Trump, we've actually seen significantly more victimization of our gun rights than under Barack Obama. And yet, the conservatives who said that we needed to continue, well, we as in they, needed to continue to hold Donald Trump to account because they've been betrayed too many times by conservatives running as Republicans who turn into basically generic neocons, and we need to hold them into account. So when we ask them to make good on that promise, when we anarchists simply hold them to the standards that they set for themselves, suddenly they have all these excuses, all these deflections, all these abilities to weasel out of their own responsibilities that they wanted to assign. Suddenly, Donald Trump is the greatest thing to ever happen to America besides sliced bread. Well, what about Reagan? Well, Reagan was good, but Donald Trump, he said the thing. Yeah, that makes him absolutely wonderful and perfect. It's absolute hypocrisy, and it really showcases the extent to which the conservative movement doesn't have any principles whatsoever. They've been consumed entirely by partyarchy, and their interests are entirely political. They just want to have their team in charge. What's the difference between their team? What's the difference between the conservative team and the liberal team? Well, you see, they have D's next to the name, so they're bad. They have no principles to speak of. They just want power. And this is very much a good example of exactly what I've been talking about for a long time about why people should not be pursuing, or why anarchists should not be pursuing political means to achieving their ends. Not only because it's an obvious, what's it called? What's the term? A performative contradiction in seeking to use political means for anti-political ends, but also because we can observe multiple times people who have been, or who are solid and principled, or at least they purport to be, and then they get power. And within days, you can see it happening in real time. People who suddenly come up with all these excuses about why they can't do this, why they can't do that, why they can't roll back people's liberty, how they have to make deals all this time, and in a few years, they just become John McCain.
Yes, I believe it was Tom Woods who said, no matter who you elect, you end up getting another John McCain.
It's always going to be the same thing over and over again, and yet I am absolutely infuriated, like genuinely angry, and I don't know why, when people like Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham and other talk show hosts and Fox News personalities, generally mainstream and second stream sources, believe that the solution is, oh, you just got to keep voting, just keep voting more. If we just vote the Republicans to have control of the House and the Senate, then everything will be great and wonderful and perfect. Oh, did the Republicans have control of all three branches, or all three have control of the legislature and the executive branch from 2016 to 2018, and they hardly did anything with it? Well, I mean, that was then, but this time will be different, I promise. I mean, I figured out what was going on years ago. I'm surprised that people who have been following this thing for decades haven't gotten tired of being betrayed yet. I wonder if it's just stupidity or if boomers are just a lot dumber than even I realize.
Well, it also kind of reminds me of 1984, the whole doublethink thing, how people would forget information or how they would believe certain information because, the party always had to be right because they were afraid to live without the party. It's basically kind of like that. It's pretty much people are afraid to live without these things, so they divvy themselves up based on, what they think is right. And then they pretty much just use that same principle of doublethink that was in 1984, where they conveniently forget that this and this happened, that these things happened. And ultimately, it just creates kind of, it does. It creates the pretty much the state of being where 1984 was pretty much an instruction manual and pretty much a predictor of the future and not just a tale of fiction. And it's very unfortunate to see that actually happening in our society, but it is the truth. So, it's very much like that. And you can have your illusions about right and left, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, but they're both essentially the same thing. I mean, it doesn't matter whether the boot is on the right foot or the left foot. At the same time, they're on the same entity. They're on the same thing, and that is called the state. So I mean, that's really where the problems come in. That's really where the problems come in, because it doesn't matter if the right's doing something now that the left was doing, years ago. People will conveniently forget that just because of convenience and out of fear of what would happen if the state wasn't around. So I mean, that's really all it boils down to.
All right, just quick thank you to Lance Clemmings for the $5 super chat. My grandpa tried to invite me for coffee, but only if I wear a mask. I told him I will only do so if they make me. Damn thing is splitting us apart. I am sorry to hear that, Lance.
Yeah, I mean, it's hardly surprising. This whole mask thing is incredibly controversial and incredibly political. I've actually had to leave a 40K roleplay I was in because we all disagree on the mask, and the GM thought I was a dumb, stupid, idiot, moron, small brain, and another guy thought that I was mentally ill, and I'm reasonably certain he would have diagnosed me with sluggish schizophrenia if he had the chance or the authority to do so. And if you don't remember, sluggish schizophrenia is a mental disorder that was invented out of thin air by the Soviet Union to justify incarcerating political opponents as mentally ill. After all, only people who are mentally ill could possibly disagree with communism, right? So they're just operating it for doing it for our own good. Now, JC Armitage here is absolutely correct. Banning TikTok for as cancerous as the thing is will set a very bad precedent, especially if someone like Biden or AOC gets into office who would happily take advantage of that precedent. Well, yeah. And I was actually going to steer the conversation back to the banning of TikTok because that is very significant. Because you effectively have a president banning a product, good, or service from sale, from public access for completely arbitrary reasons. Now, I can't we've repeated this multiple times, but I can't stress this enough. None of us like TikTok. None of us recommend using TikTok. We understand that TikTok does have Chinese spyware in it, and they are obligated under Chinese law to send information back to the Chinese government on request. That's hardly controversial, and we overtly recommend people not use it for that very reason. I've never used TikTok. I didn't even use its predecessor, Vine. And I probably was never going to use it in the past or never going to use it in the future. However, now all it's really going to do is going to make the Chinese government more influential, more powerful, because now TikTok is going to be seen as hip and cool and edgy because it's banned by the man. It's going to become anti-Trump to use TikTok now. So if anything, this is going to trigger the Streisand effect, where if you don't know what the Streisand effect is, basically it makes things that are forbidden look cool and edgy and more interesting. So what's going to end up happening?
Was that Trump's plan all along? Is he trying to promote TikTok by coming out against it, do you think?
No. I mean, I understand. I understand that. I know the whole 4D chess thing, but I've never seen any example of the 4D chess manifest ever. So I'm very skeptical if that's the case. I think he was just operating in the name of quote unquote national security. What I think his actual motive is that he doesn't want his surveillance social media programs like Facebook, like Twitter, like whatever it is that Facebook's going to be coming out with to compete with TikTok. I forget what it's called. That they don't want their surveillance programs to be facing competition. You can't surveil on our tax cattle, China. Only we are allowed to do that. That's basically what it comes down to. And it's also why I'm pretty sure that if this deal that Microsoft is making with TikTok to try to purchase the company, the software, and all that stuff goes through, you'll probably see an immediate reversal of it, because now TikTok is going to become an American surveillance thing.
Yes, it's so dangerous for the Chinese Communist Party to get a hold of American citizens' private data. Let's let Bill Gates have it instead.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we know he is completely trustworthy and honest. I mean, after all, it's not like he has a family history of being a member. Not like his family is members of the eugenics movement or anything. No, that would be ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing I'd like to talk about the executive order, again, is that under the Constitution, which we all know politicians could care less what the Constitution says, but since they all like to quote it and talk about what great constitutionalists they are, let's go back, like Filthy said, to the days of Barack Obama, where Barack Obama really used that executive order pen to accomplish a lot of things, because he said Congress just isn't doing anything. If you want to do something, pass a bill, but if you won't, I will. Well, at that time, the conservative commentators, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, said this is absolutely an abuse of constitutional power because the president does not have the authority to make laws. An executive order is merely, or at least constitutionally speaking, it's supposed to be the president's way of directing his federal agencies how to properly carry out the laws, but not actually to write the laws themselves. So in theory, and I've heard there was a Twitter thread I was reading where people were discussing this. In theory, a constitutional executive order that Trump could have used is he could have, for example, directed his agencies and say that all federal employees who work for an agency that falls under the executive branch of government are obligated to not use TikTok, because as an employee of the executive branch, you are potentially compromising confidential government information or data about yourself that could make you subject to Chinese blackmail if you use TikTok. In theory, that would be a constitutional exercise of his power, because it would be a directive to his agencies regarding something that could affect their ability to discharge their duties. He would not, however, be able to pass into law a ban on in a proctor service. The only branch of government that should, and even whether or not that would be constitutional is up in the air, but the branch of government that would be responsible for that would be Congress. And yet, when Obama bypassed Congress and they said it was constitutional, now Donald Trump's doing the very same thing for national security reasons, which, of course, national security justifies anything. That's basically what we've been talking about on all these streams. And now the conservatives are saying, absolutely great, let's do this. But just to make sure we don't get too far down that rabbit hole, I'd like to point out that as ridiculous as it is that Donald Trump thinks it's constitutional, much less small government, conservative value type thing to tell Americans they may not use a product or service, however dangerous it might be to their personal information. Just today, Donald Trump has signed another 4 executive orders. Now, remember, again, this is the same Donald Trump that said America will never be a socialist nation. What are the 4 executive orders he signed today? 1, extend unemployment benefits, provide a payroll tax holiday, defer student loan payments, and extend the federal moratorium on evictions. So using an executive order, again, not lawmaking, not a constitutional way of actually changing the laws of the land, he said you won't have to pay your payroll taxes, further deferred student loan payments, unemployment benefits are extending, and now instead of $600 extra per month, just $400 extra per month. And if you are a renter and you don't pay your rent, don't worry about it. Your landlord can't evict you. Again, Donald Trump, the president who promised this would never be a socialist nation.
I mean, he's correct. He's correct. This isn't a social. He's not making this a socialist nation. He's making it an absolute monarchy.
Seems like it.
I mean, you might as well just go full Galactic Empire and just abolish the Senate and the House of Representatives already, because you clearly don't need it. You just need to start ruling by decree. I mean, isn't it interesting how in 2020 we've had just this uptick in terms of imperial decrees, not only from the president of the United States, but also from states' governors, where they can mandate people purchase and use products, goods, or service just with a stroke of the pen.
And
Nice shift. Go ahead.
I just wanted to put in, believe me, if Donald Trump could build a Death Star, he would do it. He would do it without any question. Also, I wanted to go back to Lance's comment about how his grandpa was basically saying, wear a mask. Just tell your grandpa, I don't like breathing straight carbon dioxide for 2 to 3 hours. Just tell him that. So, but yeah.
I just tell people no.
Yeah, right.
I'm not going to comply with your paranoia and your fear mongering, because guess what? I don't watch CNN. I don't care what they think. I know they're lying to me. So.
I do like Albedo's comment here, Trump. The Republic will be reorganized into the first American empire. And you know, I am tempted to, I do think of that scene from Revenge of the Sith where Palpatine, before the Galactic Alliance, announces, you know, we no longer need a republic. We shall have a galactic empire, and everybody's cheering. And you can't help but think of one of them MAGA rallies.
I would not be surprised. I mean, we've all seen those tweets on. We've all seen those tweets from so-called conservatives who say, like, if Trump bans guns, then I'm going to be an outlaw who supports Trump. This person claiming to be a gun rights supporter. They're falling into a cult of personality. It's very clear, and it looks like Esso's here.
Esso, long time no see.
Yeah, it's been a couple weeks since I've been on the show. That's because I've successfully gotten off the grid and now live counter-economically. And the reason I haven't been on is because I've been sort of dealing with moving around and stuff like that.
All right.
Cool.
Yeah. So as for the subject of the stream, were we still talking about the U.S. Saying that they're banning TikTok? So
yeah,
we had just passed on that. That's one of several executive orders Donald Trump has passed this week. The first was that he was plans to ban TikTok nationwide, goes into effect 45 days from now. Then just today, he signed 4 more executive orders extending unemployment benefits, providing for a payroll tax holiday, deferring student loan payments, and extending the federal moratorium on evictions. So basically what he said is unemployment benefits are going to continue, except now you're only getting $400 more than you would usually vice $600. Yeah. You still don't have to pay your student loans. You won't have to pay your taxes. And if you're a renter, your landlord can't evict you if you don't pay your rent.
Okay, well, that's just news to me because I, sort of have been tuned out for most of the day today. But I did have sort of, and I'm not entirely sure if anyone said this before me, but I did have a take on, Trump or the U.S. government saying that they're going to ban TikTok. Well, just when I first heard the news, I thought it was very interesting that the media was framing it as the government banning TikTok. Because the thing with TikTok is that it's owned by the Chinese government and it's run by the Chinese government. So a ban would suggest that the government is claiming dominion over a particular commodity or firm and not allowing any sort of private management over the firm or allowing anyone to compete with said firm. So it seems very strange to me it would be framed as a ban, since it doesn't really seem like that would conceptually make sense. But then you actually look at what's happening with Microsoft trying to get leverage over the Chinese government to buy TikTok, and you look at this quote unquote free internet that Mike Pompeo was talking about earlier this week. In reality, it is just the U.S. government trying to strong-arm the Chinese government in handing ownership of TikTok over to the U.S. government, which would be a more honest way of framing that.
Mm-hmm. Now, I did want to talk about also the economics of Trump's, the final, so those 4 additional executive orders, the unemployment benefits, payroll tax, defer student loan payments. Now, I think anyone can see Trump is, obviously, Election Day is coming up in November. And despite what Trump may say about how he's pro-capitalism, against the social programs and the leftist craziness of the people in the Democratic Party and those on the left, he's smart enough to realize that if he doesn't try to buy people's votes, he's going to lose votes. So I think some could say that from a getting reelected standpoint, he's making an ingenious move. However, most people don't realize that when you say things like, I'm deferring your student loan payments, I'm extending unemployment benefits, if you're a renter, your landlord can't evict you if you don't pay. That's not making those payments go away. It's forcing somebody else to pay. if you're a renter and you're renting from a landlord who has a mortgage on that property, he's still going to have to pay his mortgage. So effectively, he's now absorbing your rent payment. Or even if he owns the property, as the landlord, he is still responsible for that property, the upkeep of it and the maintaining of it. So he's forced to eat all the costs associated with the upkeep of the property. Student loan payments, again, the teachers, administrators, and everyone else who work at institutions that receive those loans, or the banks or other entities that issued those loans, still have to make their payments. So one way or another, it's not actually erasing anything. It's just forcing somebody else to pay. And as we've talked about so many times, you could say, well, the Fed will pick up the money printers again, and which of course will assuage the problem for at least a little bit, but will only then inflate the currency, and sooner or later, the real hard limits of actual resources will be reached. So they can keep doing this dance over and over again. They're only for every problem they kick down the road, they're ensuring that the final economic collapse is going to be infinitely worse than it would have been if they'd simply let the economy collapse and let the free market reallocate the resources as it sees fit.
Mm-hmm.
So nobody else had any takes on those particular subjects. Well, I mean, I do again, so I guess I'll go. So this is something I've actually been looking to make a short video essay about, particularly regarding the unemployment benefit. But the way that those are discussed in contemporary so-called mainstream discourse is entirely backwards. The way that the state media talks about it is as if it's the government giving some leverage to the workers over the big white market firms. Well, first of all, in reality, these state-granted benefits actually, and I was talking about this with Heretic the other day in VC, actually function as a form of redistributive subsidy to the very white market firms that this is being framed in a quasi-class war narrative against, because it allows these firms to, it allows them to externalize costs that they'd otherwise have to take into calculation onto the laborers who are working for the firm. And on top of that, it makes it so there's less of a cost associated with being laid off from a particular place that you're working for. So it allows these firms to get more leverage over the people that are actually working for them in reality. And as for the hold on a minute.
So just kind of in between this. This is a little off topic, but I recently made a video where I was doing a tier list for political ideologies. And I saw one that was called Esoteric Fascism. And I actually directly mentioned you, Eso, in that video. And I was just saying something along the lines. So you know how Nate the Voluntarist, you know how he has like the Nate the Communist account on Twitter where he kind of trolls commies?
Sorry I was sort of getting mumbly towards the end there. It's because somebody came in the room and it was kind of distracting me. But go on.
Okay, well, there's apparently something called esoteric fascism. It's like called esoteric fascism, and I was thinking that if you wanted to, you could basically make up a fake account called esoteric fascist.
Make a character called esoteric fascism
and troll commies and fascists on Twitter. I just thought that'd be a fun idea. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. But I like Esso's point there where, again, the question has to be asked, whenever government does something, they're effectively picking winners and losers. Someone benefits at the cost of someone else. Whereas when you're making voluntary transactions, both parties in those transactions only make them in as much as they both feel that they benefit from it. Whereas when the government does something, they have to force at least one party to do something they wouldn't voluntarily do in order to benefit somebody else. And my point earlier that I was trying to make is that when the government says whenever the government tells somebody you don't have to pay your bills, they're effectively telling someone else you do have to pay their bills. And the winners to those outcomes always seem to be these big white market firms, the dangerous corporations the media always warns us about, always seem to be the winners.
And that's exactly where I was going with that. I don't really think that I need to get into student loan debts, because we've spoken about that before on the stream. But for the policy that doesn't allow landlords to evict tenants, well, it's sort of the same situation. It's being framed as tenants obtaining leverage over the landlords, but in reality, it's just externalizing these costs that would otherwise have to be, the productivity that would actually occur onto the landlords, and since they're the ones who are actually paying to maintain the property, the maintenance costs, it's actually creating sort of a net decline.
And there's less competition among landlords, less property being put up for rent, more housing shortages, and the larger landlords who own the most property are obviously the ones who benefit from
right.
it.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly, and it allows and since the incentives to engage in I'm trying to remember the 19th century term. I think it's jobbery. It's rent seeking. It's what they used to call it. But the incentive to either seek rents or try to the market to actually give out rents. It exists largely because of state intervention, finance manipulation, and through the state creating these artificial standards for defining land grants, through land seizure or through the recognition of deed contracts. That makes it so, that makes it fundamentally. So this isn't really an argument for the current market standard. This is just, or the current definition of land. Fundamentally, that's a creation of the state. But the externalizing costs onto the landlords is not really helping anything. It's making the divide worse.
All right. And we definitely could keep talking about that for a while. I'm going to move on here to make sure we cover everything I wanted to. I already saw a comment about this pop up in the chat, but many people may have heard about what's going on in Los Angeles. So a little bit of background, just because this is something we've talked about. It's been a long time now, but way back when we were doing the Cool Capitalist Kids podcast, I remember we talked about natural monopolies. And Filthy and I actually had a collab we did more than a year ago now called Can the Government Fix Things?, in which we talked about whether or not monopolies can actually exist without government. But let's talk about the argument that many statists make that under free market capitalism, monopolies would arise.
Yeah, long story short, the government cannot actually come in and fix things. It can only externalize costs and use coercion to make it so people can't produce, cannot actually create production.
Mm-hmm. So there are many people across the country. I'm sure you have a contract with one or more so-called public utilities. These are things like water, power. There are certain companies that are granted the sole jurisdiction to provide these services in a particular geographical area. And the argument for this was, well, if we had competing water and power companies, they'd have to build separate systems for delivering water and power to the various homes and businesses that pay them, which would be largely inefficient. Eventually, one business will beat the other out and become the sole provider. And if that ever happened, well, if there's only one sole provider of power, water, and electricity, well, what if Mr. Johnson over here He's not particularly liked by the water or power company, so they just arbitrarily decide to shut off his water and power because they don't like him. Ooh, that would be dangerous. The solution, of course, is to have a government-granted public utility. Yes, there will only be one business allowed to provide water and power, but the government will prevent that business from ever shutting off your power and water arbitrarily. Well,
that worked
behold,
really well for Flint, Michigan. That worked really well in Flint, Michigan, didn't it?
It's literally like if you actually sit down and and you don't allow them to get into rhetoric, and you don't allow the standard to be set that ends are somehow separated from the means used to achieve them. The absurdity of that reasoning is evident very quickly. The fact of the matter is, it's a monopoly. You're just using different terminology to describe it and ascribing different intentions to the owners of this monopoly and saying, "Oh, this is going to be different because the good guys have a monopoly."
Mm-hmm.
They're basically just stating that in order to prevent a monopoly from forming, we're forming a monopoly.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Well, in Los Angeles this week, what's going on? It seems a lot of the wealthy in Los Angeles have been throwing house parties, and this makes sense considering the fact that the bars and the clubs are closed. Well, the governor of California does not like this. The police have been sent to several wealthy people's homes and told them they got to shut down these parties. And now the governor of California has had enough. He is letting all the rich people in California know, if you host a party or otherwise violate the coronavirus lockdowns, I will shut off water and power to your homes. And I'm just thinking to myself, wait a minute. Weren't we told that the whole reason for public utilities, well, if we don't have a public utility, there will be a monopoly, a private company monopoly, and they could arbitrarily shut off power and water to people they don't like. That would be horrible. We've got to let the government do it. Oh, wait.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I kind of love that the governor of California has done this, because now I have this readily available recent example of exactly what we've been warning these people about.
And it's entirely arbitrary.
But then again, we didn't really need a working example to point to, because there wasn't ever an argument addressing our criticism to begin with, that since the government has a monopoly, they could just do the same thing and there'd be absolutely no recourse anyone would have in trying to stop them.
For those that are interested, economist Thomas DiLorenzo has a number of great articles about this. You can find most of them at the Mises Institute. But he has studied there's one paper he wrote called The Myth of Natural Monopoly, where he goes through just about every company that anyone has ever suggested as a natural monopoly and shows that historically, they did not become a natural monopoly and then get broken up by government. They first used the government to become a monopoly, and then after the fact hired some influential economists to try and rewrite history and claim that they were a natural monopoly once the government broke up. Of course, the most famous example, of course, being Standard Oil. Everyone talks about how Standard Oil would have taken over the world had the government not stepped in, when in reality, Standard Oil had about 21 different competitors before the government stepped in and had effectively zero after the government stepped in.
Not to mention that Standard Oil was also facing a lot of competitive pressures from smaller companies. I remember reading, pretty sure you've heard that example of how one thing a monopoly can do is just raise their prices, wait for their competitors to go out of business, and then they would lower the prices so that their competitors would go out of business and then raise them back up to normal again. That's actually not something they could do, because that they would lose a vast amount of revenue due to how market share works. So the fact, not to mention that you had various problems like this economy of scale that would make that thing ridiculously unprofitable for a large business that a small business would generally not have a problem with. So if anything, it was small companies that could threaten large pseudo monopolies with that. And the fact of the matter is, their forms of horizontal and vertical consolidation were so easy to exploit. There was a guy who made his fortune just by making fake oil companies and then selling out to Standard Oil. That's how he made his revenue. to say nothing of I forget what I was going to go, but the idea of the natural monopoly, it simply doesn't exist. I mean, I think one example in the Thomas DiLorenzo essay was how in Chicago at one point around the early 20th century, there were like 40 something energy companies, different, all providing power to Chicago in one area. Tell me it's a natural monopoly again? Of course not.
Mm-hmm. So to make a long story short, natural monopolies do not exist. The only way a monopoly can form is when the government gets involved. And lo and behold, it's the government who ends up doing the very thing they warned us that the private companies would do.
Weird. It's almost as if they're projecting.
And on that note, let's, of course, shutting off water and power to the homes of citizens because they're not complying with coronavirus lockdowns. That's pretty authoritarian. But across the Atlantic Ocean, we've got a suggestion of something that I think will raise everyone's eyebrows even more. There's an article at the UK Telegraph that says, in the UK, councils have now declared that the government has the right to demolish, quote, contaminated buildings in order to stop a second coronavirus wave. Article by a man named Gordon Rayner, and the tagline is, care homes, factories, offices, and even private homes could be bulldozed as a last resort if the virus starts to run out of control.
Last resort.
Oh,
yes.
wow.
So how long until they decide that because you're being a meanie pants and you're saying bad things about a certain politician on Twitter that they decide that, oh, we got to demolish your house as a last resort? Now, of course, what defines this is all just to point out that what defines a last resort, under what conditions do these need to be met before this last resort is triggered? Is there even a procedure by which a person is informed that their house is going to be destroyed? Or are they just going to wake up one day and then just all of a sudden their house has got explosives wrapped around it? It's very chilling, and I think everyone, especially in the UK, should be very alarmed, but of course us Americans should pay attention as well, because the UK is basically 5 to 10 years ahead of what our government is, their government is 5 to 10 years ahead of our own in terms of the kind of authoritarianism that they're going to drop upon us.
As I like JC Armitage's comment here, that won't be used against political dissidents or anything. Sarcasm.
Of course not. It'll never be used against political opponents. That would be undemocratic. After all, we're a democracy, and everyone learned in government schools that democracies can do no wrong. If not, then we'll just bulldoze. If you disagree, then we'll just bulldoze your house. And then everything will be back to normal again.
Ignore the obvious fact that the government is a coherent organization and does have a class interest to not do anything that you're told it's supposed to.
Mm-hmm. I always think, when you say that, I think of it's Larkin Rose's comment where he says, I always hate when people tell me we are the government. He says, can you not see there's a group of people over there that can come over and arrest you?
Yeah, good news is I've been hearing that one a lot less lately. So it seems that at the very least, the prevalence of anarchists are making statists, up their game. But, go to Facebook and talk to boomers. You'll probably hear that one still.
Probably. I mean, to be fair, boomers are hopeless.
Everyone in the comments, too. I just want you all to take, place bets and just pick, how long do you think it's going to be before what they're doing in Europe, they're going to do over here? How long do you think it's going to be before that?
I mean, it's kind of tricky because we don't know how long the state has left to live. We know that we know that they're basically going to be entering a hollow state position within the next 5 to 10 years. So whether or not they're going to even be able to implement European-style authoritarianism here is honestly kind of up for debate.
Well, I would like to chime in there and say one of my patrons asked me earlier today about we've been talking about, we know the U.S. dollar is going to collapse at some point. What do you really think is going to cause it to collapse, though? Again, I'm not I don't claim to be an expert. I don't claim to say I can predict exactly how it's going to happen. But I would, if you have to ask me, I'd say the trigger is probably going to be right now with the sum $4 trillion that the Fed has created since this pandemic popped off, have obviously been getting dumped into the stock market, because we've seen, despite the fact that unemployment is so high, despite the fact that production is down, somehow the stock market continues to keep rising. Well, the only way that makes sense is if all this new money is getting dumped into the stock market and artificially raising the prices there. Now, we talked about this last week, how there's a national coin shortage, because effectively the Fed is creating money faster than it can print actual dollar bills. And in any case, at any given time, there's only 3% or so actual dollar bills to back the amount of bank credit that is on in computers. So right now, we've got tons of investors who are holding on to stocks that are seemingly very valuable, but of course do not actually represent real productivity in the economy. All these investors are hoping that at some point they're going to sell these assets and be wealthier as a result. Well, there are a few people who are going to sell early and get lucky, but as people start selling and people realize these companies don't actually have the productivity, there isn't actual value behind them, and further, all this seeming value has been created artificially by new money being pumped into the stock market. Investors, as it happened in the Great Depression, as it happened in 2008 and all these other financial crises, eventually people figure it out, they panic and sell, and that is what really leads to the major depression. Only this time, when people panic and sell, the Fed will again try to turn on the money printers to stop it again, but then it's gonna be too late. Eventually that threshold is gonna get crossed. All the money, all the stored up currency power that's been created will come gushing forth. Prices will rise more rapidly than they can slow it down, and people will realize the dollar is fundamentally worthless.
Well, the dollar is going to collapse once I would say once it becomes impossible for the IMF treaties to be enforced, and that seems to be coming up pretty soon here, because that'll happen the moment that the smaller, less influential states have their central banks all default. And as of right now, as I've sort of mentioned in previous streams, that's beginning to happen. Lebanon's defaulted. Lebanon went into hyperinflation even recently. Then Argentina recently defaulted. Many European countries are operating, their central bank policies are operating around negative interest rates. So, and this has been noted for a long time, but the way that the fiat money system continues to sustain itself is not, because the illusion of validity, or because people think it has value. It's because the U.S. government and various international cartels pyramid the dollar off of the fiat produced by other nations. So they use the US dollar to back up the commodity value of the dollars used by less influential local economies, which are then traded on the international market and give artificial demand for the US dollar. Not to mention OPEC, which is used for a similar purpose, but for oil. That's why the US government has always been fiercely, involved in oil markets on the between international trade routes.
So I'd say every major war since the year 2000 has been about countries wanting to leave OPEC or otherwise reject the petrodollar.
Exactly. So that's going to be what happens. Can I tell you what country specifically it will be? No. But it's going to be OPEC and the IMF defaulting. Those are going to be sort of the maybe the World Bank as well, but it's going to be one of those cartels disbanding that causes the dollar to default, and that looks like it can happen at any moment.
Right now, I know that China and Russia are continuing their steps to de-dollarize. How long it's going to take? I mean, they've been at it since 2018. However, how long it's going to continue on for and how long before they're just completely dollar independent, I can't say. But I would pay attention to that because that looks like where most of the action is taking place. And because Russia and China, especially combined, are very large and very powerful, it's going to be very difficult for, well, the United States government to be able to bring democracy to China, in other words. Which, I mean, I can guarantee you that the U.S. military is wargaming how to bring democracy to China.
Oh, the funny thing is, when all is said and done, the U.S. government's going to look a lot more like the CCP than it will a democracy.
I mean, I really don't see the difference, honestly.
No, just there are no good guys and bad guys in this conflict. Just guys with different agendas.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
It just as all conflict in the political scene, or all political conflict, is basically just theater at best.
Fundamentally, there is no difference between the CCP, the US government, or any other government for that matter. There's just governments that are more in debt and desperate to keep the lights on than others.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, not every government is strictly the same. The US government, the Chinese CCP, obviously has different policies, different preferences, different this, different that. But fundamentally, all of them are going to agree on several fundamental premises, and that is basically the principle of screw you, I hate you, I'm going to take everything that you own, and you are going to abide by every single rule that I ever put forward, or I'm going to kill you.
All right. Well, final thing I wanted to discuss this evening. Filthy sent an article to our group chat earlier this week about a study that has found 98 quote-unquote long-term COVID-19 symptoms, one of which is baldness. This is published by Tyler Durden at Zero Hedge. Let's read the first section here. Epidemiologists readily admit that viruses are chock full of puzzles, and COVID-19 is no exception. Earlier today, that being August 5th, Dr. Fauci himself lamented the fact that nearly half of those who get the virus don't see symptoms, which is one reason why young people have been so reckless, purportedly helping to spread the virus. And in a study published recently by the University of Indiana School of Medicine, happened on a surprising finding. Those who suffer from long-term symptoms of the coronavirus, a group that researchers nicknamed long haulers, after a Facebook group where many people go for help, can experience all kinds of surprising symptoms, including baldness. Going down in the article, it lists the 50 most common long hauler symptoms of coronavirus that this study uncovered. Fatigue, muscle body ache, shortness of breath, difficulty concentrating, inability to exercise, headache, difficulty sleeping, anxiety, memory problems, dizziness, persistent chest pain, cough, joint pain. Now, I'll go near the end where it's some of the less common, but nonetheless symptoms associated with coronavirus, according to the study. Abdominal pain, lower back pain, weight gain, clogged ears, dry eyes, calf cramps, tremors, upper back pain, constant thirst, nerve sensations, tinnitus or humming in ears, change in the sense of taste, confusion, muscle twitching, and if that didn't cover it all, feeling irritable. These are all symptoms that might suggest that you have the coronavirus.
That's just getting old. That's just getting elderly. I mean, good God. Those are all symptoms of being elderly.
I mean, keep in mind that I don't know if I'm the only one, but I've observed a lot of parallels between how COVID-19 is presented, how it's covered, how it's politicized, and the parallels between that and how climate change is presented, where you have all sorts of ridiculous and even contradictory phenomena all being attributed to the same thing. Like, I'm pretty sure, like, I remember me and Esso collaborated on a video where we showcased how fewer hurricanes were blamed on climate change and more hurricanes were blamed on climate change, where the desert getting drier is blamed on climate change, the desert getting wetter is blamed on climate change, and where fog in San Francisco, where there's more of it, climate change. When there's less of it, climate change. And it's very similar to here, where you have all sorts of very common, very easy symptoms to have that a lot of people are going to have, even though they're otherwise completely healthy, but it can be blamed on the coronavirus. It's getting to the point where it's like everything that anyone is ever going to be, any illness that anyone is ever going to get ever, is going to get coronavirus. And this is probably going to result in Anthony Fauci's prophecy of 2 million Americans dying and hundred and tens of millions of Americans catching it, because the symptoms for it are so broad that literally anyone can be diagnosed if they have any one of these symptoms ever at all at any point in their lives. It's like we're getting to the point where breathing is going to be a COVID symptom.
But when you think about all those symptoms that I just read off, I mean, who on earth wakes up in the morning feeling 100% completely and utterly healthy with absolutely no feelings of pain or stress or anything like that whatsoever? Nobody. Therefore, following this to its logical conclusion, if you wake up in the morning, you must have coronavirus.
Pretty much everything is a result of coronavirus without question. And yeah, it's a very...
It's called the demarcation problem. It's something that Karl Popper initially wrote about because, you know, it's weird that he is a analytic philosopher who is concerned with falsification. But that was something that he wrote about, and I think oddly enough, it actually applies more to sort of conceptual truth and deontology than it does the method he claimed to hold on for himself. But the point that I was getting to is, the standards which are used to diagnose COVID are both incredibly vague and sort of dependent upon the interpretation of the person issuing the test, like irritation. But at the same time, it's also, these standards are also very vast, and it's becoming increasingly unclear what exactly they're being used to show or demonstrate. And that's the problem when you have too many criteria to describe the exact same thing, or that are supposedly used as proof to demonstrate the exact same thing. Is it becomes sort of unclear what you're proving. Like, you can't really prove anything.
Mm-hmm. Now, for those who have never read any of Popper's work, I do recommend it. I've often heard Popper characterized as a philosopher of science, in that his view was that what differentiated between a scientific view and a pseudo-scientific view was whether or not the view could, in principle, be falsified. His point being, if you're going to espouse a scientific theory, it makes no point. There's no point in calling it a scientific theory unless there is, in principle, some way of proving it wrong. If every possible observation, if your theory could adequately explain every possible observation, then there's no way of proving it false. And he gave a number of examples, one of which notably was communism. He pointed out that when Marx first published the Communist Manifesto, it was a scientific theory in that it made testable predictions about what would happen if and when a nation or a group of people implemented it. Historically, people tried, and it did not play out as Marx described. Therefore, under Popper's view, Marxism would have been falsified. However, the neo-Marxists, he pointed out, then essentially redefined all of Marx's view and made it such that no observation could ever, in principle, show that Marxism is false, and therefore, he said, you can't reasonably call it a scientific theory. Well, these scientists, and isn't it ironic then that the mainstream media keeps saying, you've got to listen to the scientists. The scientists, they know what's going on. Well, if nothing can even in principle show that what we're being told is wrong, then how on earth do you call this scientific? It's
not science, it's scientism. And I think I should be using a term a lot more, and I would recommend other people do it as well. It's not faith. It's not science as an understanding of what is true and what is real. It's just blind obedience to people who claim to be experts and just randomly spouting out the term science, claiming ownership of logic and reason despite having no logic and reason whatsoever.
Yeah, it's fetishizing the concept of science. Even though there's no debate over which methodology is more just, and within this framework of discussion, there's no way that you could ever have competing methodologies. and there's no way for anything to be falsified, so there's no way to prove or properly refute anything. It's just the broad term science.
Pseudoscience, basically.
It's science the way that Reddit talks about science.
Mhm.
It's, in other words, not.
It's an image of somebody wearing goggles and a lab coat, and the idea that makes them more sophisticated and intelligent.
And obviously, when you bring up a whole bunch of these conflicts of interest that a lot of people have, namely, for example, that Bill Gates is heavily invested in a lot of pharmaceutical industries, that he funds a lot of these global organizations, especially the World Health Organization, and how he's basically gone out of his way to try to vaccinate the third world. Many instances of his vaccinations resulting in cataclysmic levels of harm. For example, at one point, 80% of global polio cases were a direct result of his vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
When you point out all of this stuff, you're just dismissed as a crazy conspiracy theory, and we should just continue to have blind obedience in our divine overlords. I mean, I often characterize the political ruling class as a priesthood, but I think that there's a very good case to be made that a lot of scientists nowadays and a lot of so-called experts are another form of priesthood.
I've actually been toying with the idea of writing a video with the provocative title, Marxism is a Cult, but making this exact point that cults are not specifically a religious organization, that more times than not, cults are actually secular, and that they're cults part of, like, climate change, for instance, would be a cult. And COVID, the proponents of COVID as a pandemic, the concept of social distancing, starting to starting to show cult dynamics.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely a cult.
You've got central figures who are seen as authorities. In this case, it's Dr. Fauci. In Marxism's case, it's, the Marxist philosophers, Marx, Engels, the new ones too.
But the modern leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement and all others who openly espouse Marxism.
Yeah, with climate change, you have Bill Nye, David Suzuki, and all the scientism proponents who constantly demagogue about climate change policies, which are just redistribution schemes introduced by the state. Redistribution and nationalization schemes, I mean.
Night Shift, did you have something?
No, that pretty much wraps it up. Honestly, yeah, it's not real science. It's pseudoscience. It's there's nothing scientific about it. And if you choose to believe these, for lack of a better term, snake oil salesmen, then you're no better than any brainwashed cult member. Honestly, it's sad but true.
Mm-hmm. To quote Shane Killian, when every possible observation confirms your hypothesis, you have zero knowledge.
Right.
And on that note, we have exceeded the 1 hour mark. Boy, there is a lot to talk about, and I'm sure there'll be plenty more next week. But lest this get too long, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream there. Thank you all those viewing. Esso, good to see you again. It's been a long time. Filthy, Night Shift, thanks for being here again. And hopefully we'll see you again next week. So, as always, that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth.
Bye.